To begin with, I want to share one healing story. Unfortunately, one of my former professors from Moody Bible Institute in Chicago, Dr. Christopher Yuan, he had a health issue. Therefore, he had to have surgery. Therefore, as you can see in the picture, his mother asked for the prayer through the Facebook page to people all over the world. Especially, I took his class before. Therefore, I was concerned about his health. And by God's grace, his surgery went well, and now he is in recovery at the hospital. The reason why I share this healing story is since I saw how powerful the prayer was. In other words, there are many people who pray for his health all over the world, and God answered their prayers. Of course, he's still in pain, but I am sure that he also prayed for healing by faith and other people as well. So while I was hearing this news, it reminded me of Christian life once again. Yes, we should also need our faith in God. As there are many people who pray for healing by faith for Christopher Yuan, we should also keep our faith in our troubles as well. Do you agree? Yes. Especially today, we can find one faithful person in the passage. So let us meditate on her faith through this passage. So let us read Luke chapter 8 and verse 48 one more time. Ready, go. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." To begin with, let us find out the background of the passage today. Especially today's passage is a well-known story of Jesus healing for the woman. Therefore, there are many people focused on the miracle of healing. However, today, we'll meditate on the woman who needs to be healed, the woman. So what happened to her? For example, let us read Luke chapter 4 and verse 43. Ready, go. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and though she had spent all her living on physicians, she could not be healed by anyone. Unfortunately, she had a discharge of blood for 12 years. In other words, she had hemorrhage for a long time. Therefore, she had pain because of her disease. She had pain because of her disease. As you can see in the picture, she had been dizzy, feverish, vomiting, and shortness of breath for a long time. Likewise, she was hopeless in her circumstance. However, she wanted to be healed from her disease. That's why she was looking for physician to be healed. In other words, she tried to be healed through the power of man. Through the power of man. However, it was impossible to heal her disease. It was impossible to heal her disease. However, she did not give a lie. Especially, she had heard good news. So what was the good news? For example, let us read Mark chapter 5 and verse 27. Ready, go. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. Likewise, she had heard about Jesus. In other words, she had heard about Jesus who had the power of healing. At the time, Jesus served many people with healing. Therefore, there are many people who follow Jesus to be healed. That's why it was good news to the woman since she could be healed. Therefore, the woman decided to encounter Jesus. Especially, she took one action. So what was the action? Let us read Luke chapter 8 and verse 44. Ready, go. She came up behind him and touched the fringe of his garment, and immediately her discharge of blood ceased. Yes, the woman decided to touch the fringe of Jesus' garment. At that time, there were many people wanted to meet with Jesus, so it might be difficult to talk and meet with Jesus. Nevertheless, the woman decided to go into the crowd to meet with Jesus. However, she only decided to touch Jesus' garment. So I have one question. So why did she touch the fringe of Jesus' garment? Yes, she was assured that she could be healed by only touching the fringe of Jesus' garment. Of course, she did not take action because of superstition. In other words, she strongly believed in the power of healing from Jesus. Therefore, she decided to come closer to Jesus by touching the fringe of his garment. It was her act of faith. She kept her faith in Jesus. In other words, she wanted to be healed through the power of Jesus. She only needed Jesus in her circumstance. She only needed Jesus in her circumstance. Especially Jesus also felt someone who touched his garment. For example, let us read Luke chapter 8 and verse 45. Ready, go. And Jesus said, "Who was it that touched me?" And denied. Peter said, "Master, the crowd surround you and are pressing on you." Yet Jesus recognized someone who touched his garment. Therefore, Jesus wanted to find the one person who touched him. However, his disciples did not understand, since there are many people surrounded by Jesus. Nevertheless, Jesus wanted to find the one person for the reason. So why did Jesus want to find the one person? Let us read Luke chapter 8 and verse 46. We can find the reason. Radical. But Jesus says, "Someone touched me, for I perceive that power has gone out from me." That power has gone out from me. Likewise, Jesus wanted to find the one person who took his power of healing. In other words, Jesus already knew the reason why the woman touched his garment. Yes, Jesus knew that woman needed him. Woman needed him. Especially when Jesus explained the reason why he wanted to find the person, the woman who touched Jesus' garment was there too. Therefore, she wanted to confess about her action to Jesus in public. So let us read Luke chapter 8 and verse 47. Ready, go. And when the woman saw that she was not,
she came trembling and falling down before him and having her faces all the people why she had me, and how she had been.
especially the woman came trembling. In other words, she feared for her action. Of course, she decided to touch Jesus' garment for healing. However, she was feared for her touching. So why did she fear? Unfortunately, at that time, it was not right to touch the clean for the unclean. For example, let us read Book of Leviticus chapter 15 and verse 19 in Old Testament. Ready, go. When a woman has a discharge, the discharge in her body is blood, she shall be her menstrual imprinted for 7 days, Whoever touches her shall be unclean until the evening. Likewise, the person who had the discharge, the unclean, could not touch others, since they will be unclean as well. That's why the woman was feared, since she touched Jesus, who was the clean. Also, the woman was filled with fear, since Jesus and other people might be angry about her action. Therefore, she might get a penalty. She might get a penalty according to her action. That's why she decided to confess her sins, her faults in public. However, she also testifies to the work of Jesus. In other words, she shared her healing experience with other people in public. Especially while the woman was confessing her action, Jesus was there with the woman. Therefore, Jesus wanted to encourage her with the word of affirmation. For example, let us read Luke chapter 8 and verse 48, our passage today. Ready, go. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." First of all, Jesus called the woman a daughter. Can you say it together? Daughter. Especially when people call daughter, it was their affection. In other words, Jesus was concerned and wanted to take care of the woman who was fearful. Jesus did not leave or get angry about her touching. So Jesus wanted to encourage and comfort the woman by calling her daughter. Also, Jesus was amazed by her face. Let us read verse 48 one more time together. Ready, go. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace." Let us read this verse with the Message version once again. Ready, go. Jesus said, "Daughter, you took a risk trusting me, and now you are here and whole, live badly blessed." Likewise, the woman had faith in being healed. As I mentioned earlier, it was not right to touch, so she might get a penalty. Yes, it was a risk. In other words, touching the garment of the clean was an act of risk. Nevertheless, the woman did not hesitate to touch the fringe of Jesus' garment. Furthermore, she did not say anything about her pain to Jesus. In other words, she did not ask for healing from Jesus. Especially when we read the ministry of Jesus in the New Testament, people usually ask for healing for their disease, or Jesus is asked for their healing. However, the woman was different from other people, since she has only touched the fringe of Jesus' garment by faith. She kept her faith in the power of Jesus. That's why Jesus was amazed by her faith. So when the woman touched the fringe of Jesus' garment, her disease healed immediately. Yes, it was a miracle of healing. Therefore, Jesus wanted to tell the reason why the woman was healed. So what is the reason for healing? Yes, she had faith. It was her genuine faith. It was her genuine faith. Of course, Jesus healed her pain with his power of healing. However, Jesus saw her faith first. In other words, Jesus already knew how desperately she was to be healed. That's why she only touched the fringe of Jesus' garment in the crowd. That's why Jesus decided to heal her pain because of her faith. Yes, it was her face alone. Her face saved her from the pain of disease. Her face was able to allow to live a new life without pain. However, Jesus did not only heal physically, but heal spiritually. Can you say together? Physically, spiritually. Physically, spiritually. To be specific, Jesus also healed other people before who were sick. For example, let us read Luke chapter 5 and verse 20. Ready, go. And when he saw their face, he said, "Man, your sins are forgiven you." At the time, Jesus also healed the paralyzed man. However, people had to bring the man from the roof. Therefore, it was their actual face. Therefore, Jesus also saw their face first. And Jesus did not just heal the man, but he said that his sins were forgiven. And it refers to salvation. Can you say together? Salvation. Therefore, it was not just physical heal, but Jesus was also spiritually healed as well. In the same way, when Jesus healed the woman, it was not just the pain of physically, but Jesus saved her spiritually. She was able to be saved by God through her faith. That's why Jesus also healed the woman both physically and spiritually. Her faith was able to allow her to be saved by God. She did not save by her any works, but rather only her faith was able to save her. Especially when you read Luke chapter 5, when you read our passage, Luke chapter 4 and verse 40, Luke chapter 8 and verse 48, when you read in Korean, it said 구원, not 치료. 구원 means salvation, and 치료 means healing. Likewise, her faith was able to save her by God. That's why Jesus was amazed by her faith. Her faith was able to save her by God. Furthermore, Jesus encouraged a woman with the ordinary fairy greeting. Let us read verse 48 one more time together. Ready, go. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith is made well. Go in peace." Especially when Jesus used the word peace, it was also the same as Hebrew term shalom. So can you say each other shalom?
Shalom.
One more time, shalom.
Shalom.
Therefore, Jesus wanted to give his shalom, his peace, who was fearful in her circumstance. So today, we meditate on the healing story of Jesus. Yeah, Jesus healed the woman because of her faith. Her faith made her well. However, this story did not end yet, since it teaches us to live as Christians once again. First of all, Sola Fide. Can you say it together? One more time. Sola Fide. Sola Fide, it is a Latin phrase and it refers to faith alone. Can you say it together? Faith alone. Especially this Latin phrase, Sola Fide, used by Martin Luther was a theologian. He proclaimed this Latin phrase, Sola Fide, to focus on faith. He strongly believed that God saved people through their faith, not through their works. In other words, as salvation was a gift from God, they received it by faith. Therefore, he proclaimed Sola Fide in order to focus on faith. Especially the woman also kept her faith. In other words, her faith also reminds us of this Latin phrase, Sola Fide, faith alone. her faith was enough to be healed and saved by God. That's why Jesus was amazed by her faith. Especially, we should also live with this Latin phrase, Sola Fide, faith alone. No matter how we are struggling with our troubles or suffering right now, we only need faith, nothing else. God only wants our faith, not our worries about our troubles. In other words, we only need to trust God in our circumstance. For example, John Bunyan, who wrote the Pilgrim Progress, he mentioned faith. He said that I see the best way to go through sufferings is to trust in God through Christ. Trust in God through Christ. As he shared the story of Pilgrim Progress, the main character Christian, he also kept his faith in God on his journey to heaven. Likewise, he encouraged believers to trust in God in their circumstance. In the same way, we should also keep our faith in God in our troubles. As the woman only decided to trust in Jesus, we should also keep our faith in God. Especially, we can also find one of God's attributes in the story today. God is omnipotent. Can you say it together? God is omnipotent. Yes, God is all powerful. That's why the woman only trusts in the power of Jesus. In the same way, when we keep our faith, we should trust in His power, nothing else. Nothing is impossible with God. Therefore, we only need our genuine faith. If we keep living with Sola Fide, God will also be amazed by our faith. And secondly, draw near to God. Can you say it together? Yes, as a woman decided to come closer to Jesus in the crowd, we should also come closer to God in our troubles. Especially David, he also decided to come closer to God in his circumstance. For example, let us read Psalm 73 and verse 28. Radical. But for me it is good to be near God. I have made the Lord God my refuge, that I may tell of all your works. At the time, there were many enemies trying to accuse David. Nevertheless, David decided to draw near to God through prayer. David was assured that God would keep him safe since God was his refuge. Therefore, David did not stop praying to God. In other words, he always wanted to draw near to God through prayer. In the same way, we should also draw near to God in our circumstance. As the woman did not hesitate to come closer to Jesus, we should draw near to God in our circumstance. Let us not find other things, but let us seek the Lord with all our hearts. Especially the Apostle Paul, he also made some faith. For example, let us read the book of Ephesians 3 and verse 20. Radical. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to the power at work within us. Likewise, the Apostle Paul, he encouraged believers to pray to God, since God will answer more than what we ask. However, we need our faith first in our prayers. That's why David and the woman only kept their faith in God, nothing else. In the same way, when we keep our faith and draw near to God, God will answer more than what we ask or think. That's why the woman did not only heal physically, but spiritually. For example, I want to share my story. Last week, I have been struggling with my troubles. For example, I was worried about our church and I had some financial issue for my cafe as well. Also, I had a cold, so I had been sick last week. Likewise, I was depressed about my circumstance. However, I saw one picture on Facebook. It said that pray instead of worrying, pray instead of stressing, pray instead of panicking, pray instead of overthinking, pray instead of assuming, pray instead of controlling, pray instead of wondering. In every situation, just pray. Yes, it was a simple message, but it helped me to overcome my troubles. Therefore, I decided to not to worry about my circumstance, but later I decided to draw near to God by prayer once again. Also, our senior deaconess Park, she also prayed for me so I could overcome my health issue as well. And the reason why I share my story is since God also wants us to draw near to Him. For example, David Paulson, he mentioned faith. Can you read it together? Ready, go? You are invited to bring your troubles, your affliction, your loneliness into the heart of God's grace and deliverance. Likewise, he encouraged believers to continue to draw near to God in their circumstance. God will save them through His grace. Therefore, we should also continue to draw near to God through prayer. God invites us to come to Him once again in our troubles. So I have one final question for everyone. Where are you right now in your troubles? Where are you? Yes, we need to draw near to God. As we continue to draw near to God, we can also continue to live with Sola Fide. Sola Fide, faith alone, trust in God's power, draw near to God. Can we do it together? Ready, go? Sola Fide, faith alone, trust in God's power, draw near to God. Amen.